Hey guys, tonight we drift back to Brooklyn in the years just after the Second World War, when the air still smells faintly of coal smoke, bread baking in narrow brick ovens, and the salty push of the East River. Picture streets lit dimly by corner lamps, with boys playing stickball under the watchful eyes of mothers leaning from upstairs windows. It's here, in these tight streets of Bensonhurst, that Frank DeCicco grows up, quiet, observant, a kid who watches more than he talks. You probably won't survive this world if you can't read a man's intent from the tilt of his head or the way he keeps his hands in his pockets, and young Frank learns fast. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is there right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The DeCicco family's apartment is modest, with wallpaper that curls a little near the ceiling, and a kitchen table that always seems to have a pot of coffee brewing on it. His father works steady hours, the kind of man who carries pride in his posture and doesn't waste words. Frank inherits that steadiness, but also develops an instinct for reading the quiet spaces in conversation. In post-war Brooklyn, being underestimated is as good as being armed. The neighborhood is a mosaic of Italian immigrants, each family holding tight to traditions while adjusting to America's post-war optimism. On Sundays, the smell of sauce drifts from open windows, and street vendors push carts of fresh produce, calling out in voices hoarse from years of work. Frank moves easily among them, polite to elders, quick to help carry a heavy box. Even at 14, he understands the invisible lines of respect that run between families. It's a time when the mob's presence is felt more than seen. Everyone knows certain men control which trucks unload where and which shops get their supplies on time. Frank hears the stories, sees the nods exchanged on the corner. There's a quiet glamour to it, though mixed with the understanding that it's not a life entered by accident. He notices who speaks first when two men meet, who lingers in the shadows while someone else takes credit. School is secondary to the real education happening on the sidewalks and in the back rooms of cafes. Frank's grades aren't poor, but his attention drifts when the subject moves too far from what matters in his world. Understanding people, seeing opportunities, and keeping your word. That last part, keeping your word, is drilled into him at home. His father once tells him, "If you promise something, you do it. Otherwise, you're just noise." Frank never forgets. By the late 1950s, Brooklyn is changing. New buildings rise, and some families move out to the suburbs. But for Frank, the pull of the neighborhood is strong. The rhythm of the streets, the shouts from the bakery, the clatter of subway trains overhead, feels like part of his own heartbeat. He starts running small errands for local shopkeepers. Nothing glamorous, just deliveries and messages. Yet these simple tasks put him in the path of men who will later become pivotal in his life. One evening, while helping a fruit vendor close up, Frank notices two suited men talking in low voices. They glance at him but don't shoo him away, an unspoken acknowledgement. In this part of Brooklyn, being noticed by the right people is a first step. The trick is to be remembered for the right reasons, and Frank has the patience to let those moments add up. Even in these early years, he develops a reputation for reliability. A neighbor might say, "If Frankie said he'll be there, he'll be there." That kind of word travels. The mob, after all, is built less on paper contracts than on the quiet certainty that a man's handshake means something. Frank is learning that lesson on every block, without yet realizing how far it will take him. or how much it will cost. The DeCicco household is one of those where dinner is a sacred ritual, no matter what the day brings. Every night, Frank's mother lays out a simple spread: pasta, bread from the corner bakery, maybe sausage if it's payday. His siblings jostle for a spot at the table, and his father presides quietly, nodding approval when plates are cleared without complaint. It's in these moments Frank learns the rhythm of family loyalty. Speak less, listen more, keep the people around you close. Beyond their front door, the neighborhood hums with its own set of unspoken rules. Men in work shirts sweep the sidewalks before opening shop. Women stand on stoops gossiping while keeping an eye on their children. Every face is known, every routine predictable. That predictability is a comfort for some, and a tool for others. Frank notices who controls which corners, which conversations stop when certain men walk by. His earliest lessons in trust come from the small interactions that stitch the community together. Mrs. Romano, the widow upstairs, leaves her door unlocked when she runs to the market because she knows Frank will keep an eye out. Mr. Gallo, the butcher, trusts him to run cash envelopes across the avenue without ever peeking inside. In a city of millions, such trust is rare, and Frank treats it like gold. It's not lost on him that the men most respected in Bensonhurst are not always the ones with the cleanest reputations. There's a different kind of respect here, rooted in reliability, generosity, and the ability to get things done. Many people still think that the law has one definition of respect and the street has another, but in Frank's world, the lines blur. So what do you think? Is it respect if it comes with a debt attached? By his late teens, Frank has grown into a solid, quiet presence. He's not the loudest in a group, but his friends know he's the one who will show up at 3 a.m. if they call. That kind of loyalty draws the attention of older men, the ones who seem to spend as much time in back rooms as they do on the sidewalk. One of them, an older cousin named Anthony, takes a particular interest in him. Anthony isn't a flashy figure. He runs a small business moving produce between the docks and neighborhood grocers. But Frank notices that Anthony always knows where to find work, how to settle disputes, and when to leave a conversation. Those skills aren't taught in school, and Frank is eager to learn them. On Saturdays, Frank sometimes helps Anthony with deliveries. The job is simple: load crates of fruit into a truck, ride along, unload them. But the conversations during those drives are anything but ordinary. Anthony talks about the importance of reading people before they speak, of spotting tension in a man's jaw, of knowing when to give ground and when to stand firm. These are the kinds of lessons that stick. Brooklyn in the early 1960s isn't a place where you ask too many questions about how certain businesses run. Frank learns to focus on the parts he's meant to see: the handshake at the end of a deal, the envelope passed without a word. His role is small, but it's steady, and that steadiness is what matters. Still, he's careful. He doesn't brag, doesn't flash money, doesn't draw unnecessary eyes. If the streets are a chessboard, Frank is learning to be a piece that can move quietly across it without anyone noticing until it's too late. That ability will keep him alive in years when others vanish overnight. On warm summer evenings, after the trucks are parked and the streetlights glow amber, Frank sits on the stoop listening to the hum of the city. Somewhere, a radio plays Sinatra, the sound mixing with the hiss of a passing bus. In these moments, he feels the pull of something bigger, an unspoken current that runs beneath the sidewalks. It's not yet a calling, but it's an invitation. And Frank DeCicco has never been one to ignore an invitation. By the time Frank reaches his early 20s, the neighborhood's faces have shifted. Some of the old-timers are gone, replaced by new arrivals from the old country who bring with them a fresh set of connections and expectations. The corner cafes, once the domain of war veterans nursing coffee and cigars, now play host to younger men in crisp suits, speaking in low voices over espresso. Frank doesn't rush toward them, but he notices when they start noticing him. His introduction to the Gambino family isn't some cinematic handshake in a smoky back room. It's far subtler. It begins with a simple favor. One evening, Anthony asks him to drop off an envelope at a social club 2 streets over. Frank has done this sort of errand before, but this time, when he steps inside, the conversation halts for a moment. A man at the bar, tall with slicked back hair, gives him a once-over that feels like a weighing. Frank sets the envelope on the counter, nods, and leaves without lingering. The next day, Anthony tells him he made a good impression. "You did it the right way," Anthony says. "In and out. No questions, no smiles you don't mean." Frank doesn't realize it yet, but this is the first step onto a path that will carry him deep into the heart of the Gambino organization. The club becomes a place he visits occasionally, always on someone else's errand at first. He learns to read the room quickly, who's holding court in the corner booth, who's pretending not to listen, who's keeping watch near the door. Every visit is a lesson in hierarchy, in the quiet way authority moves without needing to raise its voice. It's here he meets his first direct connection to the Gambino network, a mid-level figure named Tony the Hat. Tony is a man of contradictions, affable when he wants to be, but with an undercurrent of steel that surfaces when challenged. He takes a liking to Frank, perhaps seeing in him a reflection of his own younger self. Tony starts giving him small tasks, collecting a payment here, delivering a message there. Frank approaches these assignments with the same steady discipline he learned from his family. He doesn't improvise, doesn't take shortcuts, and never talks about the work afterward. In a world where loose talk can sink more than ships, that restraint is valued more than ambition. The streets are changing, though. The police have grown savvier, watching certain businesses more closely. Rival crews edge closer to Gambino turf, sometimes clashing over something as small as a disputed delivery route. Frank learns that loyalty is as much about who you stand beside in tense moments as it is about long-term allegiance. One night, while driving Tony across the borough, they pass a street where police lights flash against brick walls. Tony watches quietly for a moment before saying, "Remember, Frankie, sometimes the smartest move is not being there when the trouble starts." It's a simple line, but Frank files it away. Survival in this life isn't just about courage, it's about timing. Frank's reliability starts to make him a fixture in certain circles. He's not yet part of the inner ring, but the doors are opening wider. At a card game in the back of a small restaurant, he catches sight of a man he's only heard about in murmured conversations, Paul Castellano. Castellano doesn't speak to him directly, but the air shifts in the room when he enters. Men straighten in their seats, voices lower. Frank absorbs the lesson. Real power doesn't need to announce itself. Later, walking home through streets that have long since quieted, Frank considers the invisible web of connections he's now brushing against. Many people still think that mob life is all about sudden violence and loud displays, but Frank is beginning to understand the truth. It's about the slow weave of trust, favor, and obligation. The kind that binds without you realizing until you can't step away. So what do you think? When does loyalty become a cage? For now, Frank is content to keep moving quietly, learning the names, the faces, and the rules. The Gambinos know his name now. The question is how far they'll let him go. The early 1970s in Brooklyn carry a hum that never quite goes silent. Storefront gates rattle open at dawn, delivery trucks hiss to a stop on narrow streets, and in the back rooms of certain cafes, conversations flow that never make it onto paper. For Frank DeCicco, this is the backdrop to a steady climb, one quiet, deliberate step at a time. His role with Tony the Hat shifts from casual errands to consistent work. Now he's trusted to oversee small rackets, numbers operations tucked behind barbershops, or the kind of cash-only loan arrangements that the neighborhood depends on, but never speaks about openly. Frank doesn't just collect. He listens. He learns who pays without complaint, who might be struggling, and who is likely to cause trouble. In a world where information is currency, he's starting to build wealth. His demeanor remains the same, calm, deliberate, rarely rattled. That earns him something even more valuable than money, the confidence of men higher up the ladder. One of those men is Nino Gaggi, a Gambino capo with a sharp mind for both business and people. Nino takes note of Frank's reliability and his ability to resolve disputes without letting them spiral. One afternoon, Nino calls him into a back office and closes the door. The space smells faintly of cigars and old paper. Nino leans back in his chair and says, "Frankie, the thing about this life, anyone can muscle a guy once, but to keep him coming back, that takes brains. You've got that." For a man like Frank, praise is rare currency, and he banks it carefully. The streets are thick with opportunity, but also with tension. Rival families watch each other's moves closely, and the city's economic shifts mean everyone is scrambling for a bigger piece. Frank begins handling more sensitive operations. Union influence here, construction bids there. These aren't jobs handed out to just anyone. They require someone who can blend authority with approachability, someone who can walk into a meeting and make the other side feel like they're leaving with something. Frank's methods set him apart. Where others lean on threats, he leans on conversation. Where others demand, he negotiates. This isn't softness, it's strategy. He understands that a man who fears you might obey you for a day, but a man who respects you will open doors for years. Late one night, after a meeting that ends with a handshake instead of a shouting match, Frank sits alone in his car, letting the engine idle. The city's lights flicker in the puddles on the street, and he wonders how far this approach can take him. Many people still think that you have to be the loudest voice in the room to be the most powerful, but Frank is already proving that quiet control can be just as strong. The mid-level earners begin to treat him differently. He's invited to more dinners, introduced to associates outside the borough. These aren't just social events, they're tests, each one gauging how he carries himself among different personalities and power plays. He never oversteps, never tries to claim more than what's offered. One of these dinners takes him to a restaurant in Little Italy, where between courses of pasta and veal, he meets John Gotti for the first time. Gotti, still on his own rise, has a charisma that fills the room, a stark contrast to Frank's steady, understated presence. They talk briefly, nothing more than polite acknowledgments, but something in the exchange, two very different men recognizing a shared language, will lay the groundwork for one of the most significant alliances in Frank's life. For now, Frank keeps his head down and his schedule full. The work is growing, the stakes are higher, and the circle he moves in is tightening. In Brooklyn's shifting underworld, he's no longer just a helpful kid from the neighborhood. He's becoming a man people look for when they need something done, and done right. By the mid-1970s, Frank DeCicco's name has weight in certain corners of Brooklyn, though you wouldn't know it by the way he carries himself. He still walks the same streets without an entourage, still nods to the shopkeepers he's known for decades. But behind closed doors, his standing within the Gambino network is shifting. The errands and small rackets of his early years have given way to responsibilities that come with real influence and real risk. One of the most defining turns in this period is his growing proximity to Paul Castellano. Castellano, often described as the Howard Hughes of the Mafia, is nothing like the stereotypical street boss. He's polished, business-minded, a man who prefers boardroom-style deals to bloody street disputes. Frank, with his measured voice and unflappable presence, fits neatly into that vision. He's not the kind of underling who will cause a scene. He's the kind who can sit quietly through a tense negotiation and speak only when it counts. Their early meetings are cautious. Frank doesn't try to impress. Instead, he listens. Castellano values discretion above all else, and Frank's ability to keep his own counsel earns him quiet nods of approval. Before long, he's entrusted with overseeing certain construction contracts, arrangements where the Gambinos' influence ensures the right companies win the bids and everyone involved gets their cut. This shift from street operations to business-oriented rackets is no small leap. It demands a different kind of skill, one that requires patience, paperwork, and an understanding of city politics. Frank adapts quickly, learning who at City Hall can be approached and which inspectors can be convinced to look the other way. It's a world where a handshake in a quiet office can be more dangerous than a confrontation in a dark alley. Castellano's circle is selective, and being in it doesn't go unnoticed. Other figures in the family begin to associate Frank with the boss's long-term vision. That comes with benefits, better opportunities, more lucrative assignments, but it also paints a target on his back for those who think Castellano's style is too distant from the street. Many people still think that the old ways of mob leadership, rooted in visible force, are the only ways to command respect. Frank is beginning to see the cracks in that belief, though he keeps his observations to himself. Outside the meeting rooms and contract negotiations, Frank maintains his neighborhood connections. He still attends weddings, christenings, and funerals, handing envelopes discreetly, asking after relatives by name. It's not just habit, it's strategy. He knows that no matter how high he climbs, the foundation of his influence is built on people who remember when he was just Frankie from the block. One evening, after finalizing a deal for a trucking contract that will quietly funnel thousands into Gambino-controlled accounts, Frank meets Castellano for a private dinner. Over veal parmesan, Castellano says, "You're the kind of man I can send into a room without having to worry what will come back." For Frank, it's the closest thing to a promotion notice he'll ever get. But power in this world is never without tension. Whispers are already circulating about divisions in the family. Street captains who feel sidelined by Castellano's business-first approach. Ambitious figures who think the family should return to more traditional displays of strength. Frank finds himself in the delicate position of being a bridge between two worlds, the polished boardroom and the gritty sidewalk. It's a balance he's determined to maintain, though the pressure is building. For now, he focuses on doing what he's always done, showing up, keeping his word, and letting others underestimate him until it's too late to ignore his influence. The streets may still hum the same way they always have, But the game Frank is playing now is on a much higher floor. Frank DeCicco's reputation as the silent enforcer takes shape in the late 1970s, though the term doesn't come from anything he calls himself. It's what others begin to say quietly after seeing how he resolves disputes. Unlike some who thrive on intimidation, Frank rarely raises his voice, and he never needs to make a show of force unless absolutely necessary. His strength lies in an uncanny ability to make a man see that cooperation is in his own best interest. One story that circulates in whispers involves a contractor who decided he could bypass an agreed payment schedule, thinking the Gambinos were too busy to notice. Frank paid him a visit, not with a crew, not with threats, but with a single conversation at a diner. They talked for an hour over coffee. No raised voices, no slammed fists. The next morning, the payment arrived in full. No one could say exactly what Frank had promised, but everyone knew the problem was solved. This approach makes him valuable to Castellano, who dislikes messy public incidents that attract law enforcement. It also earns Frank respect among the street captains, many of whom privately admit they'd rather deal with him than anyone else from Castellano's camp. He's seen as fair but unyielding, a man whose word binds both ways. Frank's calm nature doesn't mean he's naive. He knows when someone's stalling, when a smile hides defiance, and when patience has run its course. On rare occasions, when subtlety fails, he can be decisive in a way that leaves no doubt about his capacity for action. It's just that he prefers to make those moments rare. Many people still think that restraint in this world is a weakness, but Frank understands that every move you don't have to make is one more piece of leverage you keep in reserve. Beyond conflict resolution, Frank takes on more responsibility in overseeing union activities tied to the family's construction interests. He attends meetings where the air is thick with cigarette smoke and the sound of pen scratches on paper. His role is to ensure the right projects get greenlit and the right companies get the contracts, all while keeping the paper trail clean. Meanwhile, the FBI is starting to take a keener interest in the Gambino family. Surveillance vans become a familiar sight, parked just far enough from key locations to seem innocuous. Frank, ever observant, notices patterns. The same agents lingering near certain clubs. The same unmarked sedans drifting through the same streets. He quietly advises others to change meeting spots, switch up routines, keep conversations shorter. Despite these precautions, the sense of pressure is growing. There's tension not only from law enforcement, but from the shifting currents inside the family itself. Frank can feel the restlessness of the younger, more aggressive members, men who think Castellano's preference for business dealings over street displays is a sign the family is losing its edge. Frank keeps his counsel. He's not in the business of picking sides before the fight even starts, but he's aware that he might soon be called to stand firmly on one line or the other. For now, he continues doing what he does best, keeping operations smooth, preventing small problems from becoming big ones, and earning quiet loyalty from those who value his style. On some nights, walking home under the sodium glow of street lamps, he wonders if the balance he struck can last forever. Brooklyn has a way of reminding you that nothing stays still. Not alliances, not fortunes, not even the quiet man who everyone assumes will always be there to settle things. By the turn of the decade, Frank DeCicco's presence in Brooklyn's underworld feels as permanent as the brick storefronts lining 18th Avenue. He's not a man people cross lightly, but he's also not one they fear in the way they fear the hot-headed types who make headlines. Instead, he's respected, sometimes even liked, in a way that's rare for someone at his level. The Brooklyn crew he operates within is a tight, almost familial unit. Some of the men he works alongside have known him since he was a kid running errands for shopkeepers. Others have only met him in recent years, but understand quickly that Frank is the sort of man who won't throw you under the bus for a quick win. That reputation is currency, and Frank spends it carefully. Day-to-day operations in the borough are varied. One morning might start with a quiet coffee in a cafe, where he reviews numbers from the week's construction payouts. By afternoon, he could be stepping into a small warehouse where slot machines are stored before being placed in friendly establishments. On certain nights, he's in the back of a club, making sure the week's envelopes are in order. The work is rarely glamorous, but it's steady. And in this life, steadiness is survival. Frank has a way of making each man in the crew feel like they have his ear, even when he's only giving them a few words. He listens to complaints, settles small disputes, and makes sure nobody feels like they're being shorted. Many people still think that mob loyalty is built purely on fear, but Frank knows it's also built on the small, everyday gestures. Remembering a man's kid's birthday, making sure someone's mother gets her rent covered when times are tight. In the Brooklyn crew, Frank's word carries weight without him having to lean on threats. A raised eyebrow, a slight shake of the head, these cues are often enough to steer a conversation back on track. Even the younger guys, the ones eager to make a name for themselves, understand that if Frank says something isn't worth doing, it probably isn't. This position also means he's a conduit between his crew and higher-ranking figures like Castellano. If the boss wants something handled in Brooklyn, Frank makes it happen without drama. If there's pushback from the street level, he filters it before it ever reaches the boss's ears. This role, part manager, part diplomat, keeps him valuable to both sides. Of course, being in the middle carries its own risks. He's aware that if a serious conflict breaks out between the boardroom-minded upper tier and the street-focused captains, he might be pulled in opposite directions. For now, he walks the line skillfully, keeping his relationships with both camps intact. Even outside work, his presence in the neighborhood reinforces his status. He's at every charity dinner, every church fundraiser, and every funeral that matters. His handshake is firm, his nod deliberate. People remember that he shows up, and in a place like Brooklyn, showing up counts for a lot. Still, the undercurrent of change is there. Small tensions, whispered doubts about leadership, younger men looking to shift the balance of power. Frank doesn't know exactly how or when those currents will break, but he's certain of one thing. When the tide turns, the relationships he's built in Brooklyn will be his anchor. The early 1980s bring a subtle tightening of the air around the Gambino family. Law enforcement is watching more closely, and inside the organization, the quiet rumbles of discontent are starting to echo through the ranks. Frank DeCicco, always observant, senses that the balance between diplomacy and muscle is becoming harder to maintain. Navigating mob politics is never about grand speeches. It's about knowing when to speak and when to let others talk themselves into a corner. Frank excels at this. He has the patience to sit through hours of back and forth between captains, letting tempers flare and fade before he weighs in. When he finally does, his words carry weight precisely because they're rare. One particular meeting stands out. Several captains are arguing over control of a lucrative trucking route. The debate has gone in circles for an hour, with voices rising and chairs scraping. Frank sits quietly, sipping his coffee, until one captain tries to pull him into the argument. He sets the cup down and says, in a steady tone, "If you two can't figure out how to make money without stepping on each other, maybe neither of you should touch the root." The silence that follows is telling. The matter is settled within minutes. This skill doesn't go unnoticed by Castellano, who increasingly relies on Frank to act as an intermediary in disputes that might otherwise end badly. Yet Frank also keeps lines open to the street captains who chafe under Castellano's boardroom approach. Many people still think that taking a middle position in mob politics is a sign you lack conviction, but Frank knows better. It's a way to see both sides, to adapt when the inevitable shift comes. Part of this adaptability is knowing the value of information. Frank hears things. Who's quietly meeting with whom, who's skimming more than their share, who's feeling boxed out of the action. He doesn't rush to report everything. Instead, he keeps it in reserve, ready to use if it can prevent a crisis or protect his crew. The social clubs remain a key battleground for influence. Frank makes his rounds deliberately, never staying so long in one place that he becomes predictable. At each stop, he shakes hands, listens to grievances, and lets people feel they've been heard. This, too, is politics, not the kind played in City Hall, but the kind that decides who eats well and who ends up out in the cold. Despite the building tensions, there are moments of ease. On warm summer nights, Frank can be found sitting outside a cafe with a small group, espresso in hand, trading quiet jokes and stories. These lighter moments are part of his method. They humanize him in a world where many leaders isolate themselves behind closed doors. Still, there's no ignoring the fact that the family is on a slow collision course. Castellano's preference for keeping the streets quiet and the books clean clashes with the ambitions of those who see opportunity in flashier, more aggressive moves. Men like John Gotti, with his magnetic pull and street-born authority, are becoming the center of whispered conversations about the future. Frank doesn't rush toward either side. For now, his loyalty to Castellano remains intact, but he also knows better than to close doors. The smartest men in this life don't just prepare for the next week. They prepare for the next decade. And Frank DeCicco, without making a single loud move, is doing just that. By 1983, Frank DeCicco's responsibilities have stretched well beyond Brooklyn. His work now includes oversight on key construction projects, trucking routes, and even quiet influence in certain labor unions outside the borough. Expansion is a sign of trust from Castellano, but it also means Frank is stepping into territories with their own histories, rivalries, and under-the-table arrangements. The trucking business, in particular, is a delicate balance. On paper, the routes are awarded through legitimate bids. In reality, each delivery lane is a patchwork of handshake deals, kickbacks, and promises made years ago that still need honoring. Frank handles these with the same calm consistency he's known for, traveling to warehouses before dawn to meet with foremen, slipping into mid-morning meetings where contracts are adjusted before being signed. In one instance, a delivery company backed by the family runs into trouble when a city inspector threatens to shut down their operation over safety violations. Frank pays the inspector a visit, not with threats, but with an offer. If the violations can be reclassified as minor and handled with a modest fine, the inspector's brother's struggling business might find itself with a steady stream of transport contracts. Within a week, the problem vanishes. The construction side is no less complex. Frank ensures the right suppliers get the orders, the right companies win bids, and everyone down the chain understands who made it happen. Many people still think that mob influence in construction is about leaning on people until they give in. Frank knows it's just as much about giving the right people a reason to want you in their corner. His reach within the Gambino network now means he's working closely with figures from other boroughs, smoothing over disputes before they turn into full-blown turf wars. The work is draining at times. Each handshake feels like both a promise and a potential liability. But Frank thrives in the nuance, knowing that keeping everyone just satisfied enough is what keeps him valuable. It's during this period that his bond with John Gotti begins to deepen. Gotti is running his crew with energy and flair, and while their styles are different, there's mutual respect. Frank appreciates Gotti's ability to rally men quickly. Gotti sees in Frank a steady, unshakable counterbalance to his own high-energy approach. They meet more frequently now, sometimes at social events, sometimes in quiet side conversations after a larger meeting. Outside the boardrooms and cafes, Frank still keeps a visible presence in Brooklyn. He attends neighborhood events, drops in at old haunts, and keeps the local crew feeling connected. Even with his expanded influence, he knows the danger of losing touch with the people who once saw him every day. There are challenges, though. Increased FBI surveillance means more eyes on every move. Conversations that once took place in open dining rooms are now shifted to walks around the block. Phones go unused for anything important. The paranoia is real, but Frank never lets it show. If the agents watching from unmarked cars are hoping to catch him rattled, they'll be waiting a long time. At night, after the day's rounds are done, Frank often sits in the quiet of his home, sorting through the threads of alliances and obligations. It's a web he's been weaving for years, but it's also one he's entangled in himself. In this world, the difference between holding the web and being caught in it can shift overnight. Frank DeCicco's connection with John Gotti begins to move beyond the occasional friendly exchange into something more deliberate. By the mid-1980s, Gotti's star is rising fast within the Gambino family. His command of the Bergen crew, his bold moves, and his street-born charisma make him a rallying point for those dissatisfied with Paul Castellano's style. Frank, still officially aligned with Castellano's upper-tier vision, manages the rare feat of being respected by both sides. It starts with small collaborations. Gotti's men need a particular delivery cleared without interference, and Frank makes a call to ensure the paperwork finds its way through the right channels. Another time, Frank needs a street issue resolved in Queens, and Gotti's crew handles it quietly. These favors are exchanged without drama, without paperwork, and without either man keeping a running tally. In their world, that's the purest form of trust. The contrast between the two men is striking. Gotti draws attention wherever he goes. Tailored suits, wide smiles, quick jokes that land in a room like firecrackers. Frank is the opposite. Steady, understated, letting the noise swirl around him without ever losing his footing. Many people still think that partnerships in the mob are forged purely on shared ambition. But Frank knows the strongest ones are built on complementary strengths. Gotti's energy and Frank's restraint form a balance that both men find useful. Their growing rapport doesn't go unnoticed. Some in Castellano's circle view it with suspicion, wary of the street captain's growing influence. Others in Gotti's orbit see Frank as a bridge, someone who can soften the inevitable clashes between the two factions. Frank, for his part, isn't playing both sides so much as keeping every door open until the future becomes clearer. One night, over a late dinner at an Italian restaurant in Queens, the two men talk about the pressures they face from different angles. Gotti complains about Castellano's distance from the street and the way some captains feel ignored. Frank listens, offering few words but making it clear he understands. When he does speak, it's to remind Gotti that moves made in frustration often carry the heaviest costs. Gotti smirks, acknowledging the point without promising restraint. Frank doesn't delude himself. He knows the undercurrent of tension between Castellano and the street captains is building towards something, but he also knows the value of being indispensable to more than one power base. It's not about hedging bets. It's about ensuring survival when the inevitable shift comes. Meanwhile, his own responsibilities remain demanding. The union work, trucking routes, and construction contracts all require constant oversight to keep law enforcement at bay and rival crews from encroaching. He's also keeping a sharper eye on federal investigations, which seem to be picking up speed. Surveillance is tighter, indictments are becoming more frequent, and even casual associates are being pulled in for questioning. Frank's calm approach continues to earn him loyalty at every level. For the street guys, he's approachable without being soft. For the upper ranks, he's efficient without being flashy. For Gotti, he's a trusted ally who can be relied on to keep things steady when tempers flare. In a life where alliances can shift overnight, Frank's bond with Gotti is something different. It's an understanding that doesn't need to be spoken aloud, a handshake that carries more weight than most formal agreements. Whether that bond will be a lifeline or a liability in the years ahead is a question neither man asks out loud. The rift between Paul Castellano and the street captains begins to sharpen in 1985, and Frank DeCicco finds himself standing in a narrowing middle ground. Castellano's insistence on pushing the family deeper into white-collar rackets, construction, trucking, garment industry deals, has alienated those who built their reputations on street operations. Meanwhile, John Gotti is becoming the voice of that restless faction, his charisma and visibility making him an unspoken challenger to Castellano's authority. Frank walks this tightrope with the same measured care he's always used. He still attends Castellano's business-oriented meetings, sitting quietly at the long table in the boss's Staten Island mansion, listening to discussions about corporate fronts and contract kickbacks. Castellano trusts him to keep these details airtight. Yet Frank also makes time to stop by the Bergen Club, sharing a coffee with Gotti, catching up on the latest from Queens, and maintaining the easy rapport they've built. Tensions flare in small but telling ways. Castellano grows more reclusive, issuing orders through intermediaries rather than showing his face in the neighborhoods. Some captains interpret this as weakness, others see it as arrogance. Gotti complains to Frank about the disconnect, while Castellano hints that certain street captains are getting too big for their boots. Many people still think that a man can stand between two camps indefinitely if he's clever enough, but Frank knows the truth. Sooner or later, both sides will demand a choice. What makes his position unique is that both factions genuinely value him. Castellano sees him as a rare captain who understands the boss's vision without losing touch with the street. Gotti sees him as a man who can be trusted not to leak conversations or play petty games. Frank's strategy is to be useful to everyone, essential to at least a few, and threatening to no one. The FBI, however, isn't interested in the nuance of his diplomacy. Surveillance around Castellano's mansion intensifies, and wiretaps start picking up conversations between key figures, some of them implicating Frank by association. He becomes more careful, taking fewer calls, moving certain discussions to safe locations. The paranoia is warranted. Indictments are coming down in other families, and it's clear the Gambinos aren't far behind. In the midst of this, Frank still finds time for the smaller, quieter gestures that define his style. He visits old neighborhood friends in the hospital, makes sure a widow's mortgage is quietly covered when her husband, a longtime earner, passes unexpectedly. These acts are noticed and remembered, even if they never make it into the official history of the family. By the summer of 1985, the undercurrent of tension has become impossible to ignore. The conversations with Gotti grow longer, more speculative, while Castellano's inner circle becomes tighter and less transparent. Frank is experienced enough to know what this means. The family is approaching a fracture point. The question now is whether he'll step to one side before the break, or wait until it happens and try to land on his feet afterward. Either way, the middle ground he's been walking is disappearing beneath him, and he can feel the clock ticking. The weeks leading into the winter of 1985 feel heavier than usual. In the Gambino family, movements are slower, conversations more guarded, and familiar routines quietly shift. Paul Castellano's health rumors swirl. Some say he's unwell. Others claim he's simply tired of showing his face on the street. Whatever the truth, his absence from the familiar haunts is feeding the sense that change is coming. Frank DeCicco keeps to his steady rhythm, but even he can't ignore the tightening coil. His visits to Castellano's Staten Island mansion now carry a sharper awareness. The meetings feel smaller, more insular, and the air around the table holds a tension that wasn't there a year ago. Castellano still talks about legitimate fronts, labor agreements, and market shares, but Frank notices the subtle defensiveness in his tone, as if he knows not everyone in the room is still fully aligned with him. On the other side of the city, the Bergen crew is running at full throttle under John Gotti's lead. The energy there is different, brash, confident, restless. When Frank visits, he can feel the undercurrent in every laugh and side conversation. Gotti doesn't hide his frustration with Castellano's leadership, and in quieter moments, he hints at wanting the family to return to a more street-centered way of operating. Frank listens, but says little. Many people still think that silence in such conversations is a sign of agreement, but Frank knows silence can also be a shield. He's careful with his words, making sure they can't be repeated to either camp as evidence of disloyalty. Still, it's impossible to ignore that he's becoming a trusted link between the two worlds. If Gotti needs to know how Castellano is thinking, Frank is one of the few men whose word he'll take without suspicion. If Castellano wants to gauge the mood among the street captains, Frank's perspective is one of the few he considers uncolored by personal ambition. Outside these high-stakes circles, Frank continues handling his operations with precision. The trucking and construction rackets are steady, and he's managed to keep law enforcement heat from getting too close to his immediate crew. He's also discreetly helping some associates adjust their routines to avoid surveillance. A quiet reminder that his loyalty extends beyond the boardroom politics currently consuming the family. One evening, during a walk with Gotti after a late dinner, the conversation turns uncomfortably direct. Gotti stops mid-step, looks at Frank and says, "If it came down to it, if the streets had to take things back, where would you be?" Frank's reply is as measured as always. "I'd be where I could do the most good for the people I care about." It's not a commitment, but it's not a refusal either. Back home that night, Frank sits in the quiet, replaying the words in his mind. He knows he's just stepped a little closer to the line, whether he meant to or not. In this world, lines have a way of vanishing before you realize you've crossed them. December 1985 arrives with the kind of cold that bites through wool coats and turns every breath into a visible cloud. In the Gambino family, the air feels just as sharp. Rumors aren't just whispers anymore. They're conversations had in back rooms under lowered voices about what might happen to Paul Castellano and the direction of the family itself. Frank DeCicco is moving carefully through these days. Every meeting, every phone call, every handshake is weighed for what it might reveal. He still visits Castellano at the Staten Island mansion, but he senses the walls tightening. Castellano keeps the circle small, sharing less, looking for signs of loyalty in every face. The boss still values Frank's input, yet Frank notices he's being asked more often about what he's hearing from the street. A sign Castellano knows his grip is loosening. Over in Queens, the Bergen crew's energy is growing more focused. John Gotti has been having longer, quieter conversations with trusted allies, disappearing for stretches of time and returning with a look that says decisions are being made. When Frank stops by, the questions come in reverse. What's Castellano's mood? Who's spending time with him? How often does he leave the house? Frank answers with enough truth to stay credible, but never so much that it's clear he's favoring one side. This balance is becoming razor thin. Many people still think that you can navigate mob politics like a permanent middleman, but Frank knows history doesn't support that. In the end, power consolidates, and men in the middle either pick a side or get swept off the board. In mid-December, Frank gets a call to meet at a familiar spot in Manhattan. The meeting is small, just him, Gotti, and a couple of others. The conversation isn't explicit, but the tone is unmistakable. They talk about making things right, about returning to a style of leadership that commands respect from the sidewalk up. No names are spoken in connection with what's being planned, but Frank doesn't need them. The following days are thick with anticipation. Castellano schedules a dinner meeting at Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan for December 16th. It's framed as a business discussion, but the choice of location, the timing, and the guest list feel oddly exposed. Frank isn't invited to this one, and that alone tells him something. On the day of the meeting, the city moves under its usual holiday bustle. Storefronts lit up, steam rising from manholes, people hurrying with wrapped boxes. By nightfall, news will break that Paul Castellano has been gunned down in front of Sparks in one of the most public mob hits in New York history. Frank hears about it within minutes. The shock isn't about the act itself. He's seen power change hands before, but about the sheer audacity of it. Castellano, the untouchable boss, cut down in the middle of Midtown during the dinner rush. It's a statement no one can misinterpret. That night, as the news cycles replay the scene, Frank sits in the quiet of his home, knowing the family he's served for decades has just entered a new era. Whatever comes next, his role in it will be shaped not by what he says now, but by every choice he's made in the years leading up to this moment. The morning after Paul Castellano's assassination, New York wakes to a chill that seems sharper than the weather alone can explain. Headlines scream the news, radios hum with speculation, and television anchors speak in the careful tones they use when talking about something everyone knows, but no one can say outright. In the streets where the Gambino family's reach is felt, there's a different kind of quiet. Less shock, more watchfulness. Frank DeCicco knows better than to appear hurried or rattled. He makes his usual rounds, stopping for coffee in Brooklyn, greeting the same shopkeepers, checking in on a few of his own operations. But behind the steady exterior, he's calculating. Castellano is gone, and John Gotti is now, for all practical purposes, the new boss. even if the formalities haven't yet been observed. Frank's years of balancing between the two worlds are about to be tested in ways they never have before. The funeral for Castellano is sparsely attended by high-ranking figures. The risk of being seen there is too great, given the scrutiny from law enforcement. Frank goes, paying his respects quietly, aware that his presence will be noted by both the FBI and Gotti's camp. Many people still think that these moments are about personal grief, but in the mob, a funeral is as much about sending signals as it is about saying goodbye. In the days that follow, the Bergen crew's headquarters becomes the new unofficial center of the Gambino universe. Captains, soldiers, and associates stream in, some to pledge loyalty, others to see where they stand. Frank is among the first to show his face, not with fanfare, but with quiet certainty. For Gotti, this is confirmation. DeCicco is with him. The conversation between them is short but decisive. Gotti, dressed sharp even in this tense moment, says, "I'm gonna need you close, Frankie." Frank nods. "You'll have me. No conditions, no hesitation. That's all it takes." Behind closed doors, the mechanics of transition move quickly. Territories are reassigned, crews reaffirm their allegiances, and Castellano loyalists who might resist are either brought into the fold or frozen out. Frank becomes a crucial part of this reorganization, his calm demeanor and long-standing relationships making him the perfect man to smooth over potential fractures. The FBI is watching all of it. Surveillance teams plant themselves outside the Bergen Club, following anyone who goes in or out. Frank adjusts to the new normal, keeping conversations vague in public spaces, shifting sensitive discussions to walks, car rides, or rooms with the radio turned up loud. Gotti's leadership style is the opposite of Castellano's: public, flamboyant, and magnetic. Frank plays the counterweight, handling the quieter, behind-the-scenes work that keeps the machinery running smoothly. He becomes the man Gotti can trust to take care of the details while he manages the spectacle. In a matter of weeks, Frank has transitioned from Castellano's measured underboss-in-waiting to Gotti's indispensable right hand. And though the family's direction has shifted overnight, his role remains what it has always been, making sure the wheels keep turning, no matter who's sitting in the driver's seat. Frank DeCicco settles into his new role beside John Gotti with the same unhurried precision that has marked his entire career. Officially, he's the underboss now, the second most powerful man in the Gambino family. Unofficially, he's the one who makes sure the chaos of a leadership change doesn't derail the family's earning power. From day one, Frank becomes the balance to Gotti's charisma. While Gotti enjoys the spotlight, attending high-profile dinners and walking into clubs with a tailored swagger, Frank handles the less glamorous but more essential side of things, ensuring the captains are aligned, disputes are settled, and revenue streams flow without interruption. In the underworld, stability is currency, and Frank spends it wisely. He starts his mornings early, often with quiet check-ins at social clubs before the day's heat builds. The men know that when Frank asks how things are going, he's not making small talk. If there's a problem, now is the time to bring it up, before it escalates into something that requires a public show of force. Many people still think that an underboss's job is about giving orders, but Frank knows it's more about listening, filtering, and making decisions that keep everyone earning and out of unnecessary trouble. One of his key strengths is his memory for detail. He knows which captain's cousin is getting married, whose mother is ill, who's been quietly shorting envelopes. These details aren't trivia. They're leverage, goodwill, and at times, early warning signs. The FBI, of course, is relentless. Surveillance follows him from Brooklyn to Queens to Staten Island, cameras clicking from across the street, agents leaning against cars pretending to read newspapers. Frank treats it like bad weather, annoying, but nothing that changes the work to be done. He varies his routes, avoids patterns, and keeps sensitive business away from anything with a microphone in the wall. His relationship with Gotti deepens in these months. They meet often, sometimes in the back of the Bergen Club, sometimes during long drives with no fixed destination. Gotti talks big picture strategy, how to expand influence, how to strengthen the family's image. Frank responds with practical pathways, ensuring ideas can be turned into action without leaving loose ends. Not every day is smooth. Some captains resent Gotti's style and grumble quietly. Frank deals with them patiently, offering reassurances where he can, drawing firm lines when he must. He knows that in the mob, respect is often a matter of making people feel heard, even if their requests are denied. Outside of business, Frank maintains his presence in the neighborhood. He attends charity dinners, drops into old friends' shops, and makes himself visible in a way Castellano never did. This isn't vanity. It's a reminder to the street that he's still Frankie from Brooklyn, a man whose roots are as real as his title. By early 1986, the Gambino family under Gotti and DeCicco is running smoothly on the surface. Money flows, disputes are minimal, and the leadership looks strong. But Frank knows better than to believe calm seas will last forever. In this life, storms are always forming somewhere on the horizon. Despite his elevated rank, Frank DeCicco never drifts too far from the rhythms of Brooklyn neighborhood life. Being underboss could easily have turned him into a shadow figure behind club doors, but Frank understands that power in the Gambino family is reinforced by visibility. So he still walks the streets where he grew up, stopping into bakeries for coffee, greeting old-timers by name, and slipping a little cash to the parish when the donation plate comes around. He knows the value of these small acts. They keep him grounded and maintain the kind of goodwill that no amount of muscle can buy. When a local shopkeeper's delivery truck is vandalized, Frank hears about it before the police do. Within a day, the damage is repaired, and the shopkeeper knows exactly who to thank, without ever being told directly. Many people still think that leadership in the mob is measured only in money and muscle, but Frank has always understood that influence is just as much about protecting the people who will protect you in return. At the same time, he's careful not to romanticize his standing. Every handshake, every favor, is part of a larger network of obligation. He's aware that some of the men smiling at him on the sidewalk would switch allegiances in a heartbeat if the balance of power shifted. That awareness shapes how he interacts, warm enough to inspire loyalty, distant enough to avoid becoming vulnerable. Inside the Gambino structure, his role as underboss means he's constantly moving between the gritty realities of street crews and the higher-level business operations that keep the family profitable. Mornings might start with a meeting about concrete contracts and union negotiations. Afternoons could be spent smoothing over a territorial dispute between captains. By nightfall, he might be at a christening, a wedding, or a wake. Places where business talk is disguised as small talk over wine and cannoli. Frank handles each setting with the same measured calm. He listens more than he speaks, never overpromises, and ensures that when he does commit to something, it gets done. This reputation makes him one of the few figures in the family who can walk into almost any cruise social club and be welcomed without suspicion. Still, he's not blind to the risks of being underboss to a boss like Gotti. The attention Gotti draws from the press and law enforcement means every move is under a magnifying glass. Surveillance teams follow not just the boss, but anyone in his orbit. Frank adapts by keeping his own activities understated. No flashy suits, no unnecessary appearances in the media's lens. Even with the heat, he maintains a steady hand on the wheel. Disputes are settled quietly, earnings are steady, and Gotti trusts him to keep the gears turning while he handles the high-profile side of leadership. For Frank, it's a familiar balance, being close enough to power to influence it, yet far enough from the spotlight to maneuver without constant interference. By the spring of 1986, the streets know exactly where to find him if something needs fixing, and the upper ranks know exactly who to call when something needs doing right. Frank DeCicco has become what he's always aimed to be: indispensable. Frank DeCicco's loyalty to John Gotti is never in question. In the first full year of Gotti's reign, Frank becomes the hinge on which much of the family's day-to-day stability rests. When the boss wants something enforced, it's Frank who makes sure it happens without unnecessary noise. When a decision risks alienating part of the family, Frank is the one smoothing it over before resentment takes root. The two men work in tandem despite their contrasting styles. Gotti thrives on visibility, expensive suits, open displays of confidence, and a willingness to be photographed stepping out of limousines. Frank remains understated, blending into the background even when standing beside the boss. Many people still think that loyalty in the mob means mirroring the boss's every move, but Frank understands his role is not to be a shadow. It's to be a counterweight. That counterbalance shows in how he handles critical decisions. When Gotti wants to push forward on an aggressive move against a rival crew, Frank weighs the long-term consequences. He doesn't say no outright, but he asks the right questions. How it affects income, which captains might see it as overreach. How law enforcement might react. Gotti listens, sometimes changing course, sometimes not, but always respecting the fact that Frank speaks from experience rather than ego. Within the family, Frank's influence is felt in the small things as much as the big ones. He keeps the captains talking to each other, encourages crews to share resources rather than compete, and makes sure disputes are resolved before they spiral. Even soldiers who have never sat down with Gotti directly know Frank's reputation for fairness. Outside of internal politics, Frank still has to navigate the constant pressure from law enforcement. The FBI's attention hasn't eased since Castellano's murder. In fact, it's intensified. Agents park outside the Bergen Club for hours, follow cars, and occasionally make their presence obvious just to unsettle people. Frank doesn't take the bait. He continues running operations as if the agents weren't there, adjusting routines just enough to make surveillance tedious and unrewarding. One evening in the late summer of 1986, Frank and Gotti take a drive together, just the two of them. The conversation turns to the future, how to strengthen the family's hold, how to expand without attracting too much heat. Gotti talks about making bold moves to cement their place. Frank talks about shoring up the foundation so it can withstand the weight of those moves. By the end of the night, they've mapped out a plan that blends both approaches, a mix of Gotti's ambition and Frank's pragmatism. That's the rhythm of their partnership. One man setting the pace, the other making sure the road ahead is clear. And in a world where both speed and stability can mean survival, that combination is what keeps the Gambino family not just afloat, but thriving. Tensions with rival crews never fully disappear, even in a period of relative stability. By late 1986, Frank DeCicco is dealing with a series of disputes that could have easily flared into open hostilities if not handled with care. Some are internal, captains arguing over construction territories or loan sharking clients. Others come from outside the Gambino family, with crews from other families testing boundaries to see if the new Gotti regime is as formidable as its image suggests. Frank approaches each of these challenges with his usual methodical calm. When a Colombo crew member edges into Gambino trucking territory in Brooklyn, Frank doesn't immediately send muscle. Instead, he arranges a sit-down with a Colombo captain he's known for years. Over espresso in the back of a cafe, they map out an arrangement that preserves Gambino earnings without making the other side lose face. In their world, that's as close to a win-win as it gets. Still, not every situation can be smoothed over with conversation. In one instance, a Gambino-connected bookmaker refuses to pay tribute, believing Gotti's flashy leadership style means enforcement will be inconsistent. Frank visits in person, accompanied by just one trusted man. The conversation is short, and within 48 hours, the arrears are paid in full. The message is clear. Quiet doesn't mean weak. Many people still think that the absence of fireworks in mob disputes means nothing is happening. Frank knows the real work often happens out of sight, in low voices and unremarkable rooms. As underboss, he also has to manage the egos within the Gambino ranks. Gotti's charisma draws loyalty, but it also inspires ambition in men who want a bigger cut or more territory. Frank keeps these impulses in check, reminding captains of the bigger picture: steady income, minimal law enforcement heat, and a united front against outside threats. He has a way of delivering these reminders without making them sound like orders, which is part of why they work. In private, he keeps Gotti informed but filters the noise. Not every complaint needs to reach the boss, and Frank takes pride in solving problems before they escalate. This, in turn, allows Gotti to focus on maintaining the family's public image and expanding its reach without getting bogged down in the small fires that pop up daily. The FBI's shadow remains. Surveillance is so constant that Frank sometimes jokes to trusted friends that he should start sending the agents coffee to make their long nights easier. But even as he jokes, he keeps a disciplined routine, varying his routes, keeping sensitive meetings short, and ensuring every associate knows the rules about where and when to talk. By winter, the Gambino family's rivals have adjusted to the reality that the new leadership isn't easily pushed. Frank's role in that perception is understated, but crucial. He's the one making sure that disputes are resolved in ways that strengthen the family's reputation without unnecessarily spilling blood. In this world, the balance between force and restraint isn't just strategy, it's survival. Frank DeCicco's life away from the street is quieter but no less demanding. Being underboss doesn't just mean balancing business and politics. It also means balancing the personal toll this life takes. He's a family man in his own way, careful to keep the most dangerous details of his work away from home. Those close to him know not to ask too many questions, and Frank, in turn, makes sure the benefits of his position reach them without the risks. At family gatherings, he is the same steady presence he's always been, offering a glass of wine, carving meat at the table, listening more than he speaks. His relatives see him as dependable, the one who can be counted on in times of trouble. Many people still think that men in his position live completely apart from domestic life, but Frank treats his home as an anchor. It's where the noise of the street can't reach him, where he can go an evening without thinking about envelopes, sit-downs, or surveillance. Still, separation is never complete. Even at a Sunday dinner, a phone call might pull him away for an errand. Sometimes it's just a quick check-in with a captain, Other times, it's a problem that needs his personal touch. Frank's way of handling these interruptions says much about him. He excuses himself quietly, never making a show of the urgency, and when he returns, he resumes his seat as if nothing happened. He's mindful of how his work affects those around him. Gifts arrive discreetly: a new appliance for a relative's kitchen, an envelope for a nephew's schooling. He never announces where it comes from, but the message is clear. He takes care of his own. That quiet generosity builds loyalty that extends beyond the street. In moments of reflection, Frank sometimes considers the contradictions of his life. He's part of an organization built on control, yet the forces that could upend it, law enforcement crackdowns, internal betrayal, rival moves, are often beyond any one man's control. Home gives him a place to think without the constant hum of mob politics in his ear. The neighborhood still sees him as Frankie from Brooklyn, even if they know the weight of his title now. At local events, people greet him warmly, shaking his hand with a mix of familiarity and respect. He makes time for these appearances not because they're strategic, though they are, but because they remind him of where he came from. In the end, the balance he maintains between home and the life is fragile, but it's also what keeps him grounded. The street demands everything from a man, but Frank has managed, so far, to keep a part of himself intact, untouched by the constant calculations and quiet dangers that define his work. By early 1987, Frank DeCicco begins to sense that the period of relative calm under Gotti's leadership won't last forever. For all the Gambino families earning power and public confidence, there are currents moving beneath the surface, currents that could easily drag the whole structure into rough water. Law enforcement pressure is intensifying, rival families are probing for weaknesses, and not every captain in their own ranks is content with the way things are being run. Frank handles these pressures with his usual unshakable composure. When trouble is brewing, he prefers to address it quietly and directly. If a captain's crew is coming up short, Frank doesn't send a messenger. He sits with the man himself, looking him in the eye and explaining exactly why the shortfall needs to be fixed. Without shouting, without threats, but with a tone that makes it clear the matter isn't open to debate. Many people still think that power in the mob comes from how loud you can be. Frank knows it comes from how certain you are when you speak. Gotti relies on this steadiness more and more. The boss's own profile is higher than ever, too high for some tastes, drawing media attention and constant FBI scrutiny. Frank acts as the pressure valve, keeping daily operations running and ensuring that captains who feel sidelined still have a voice. He knows that resentment left to fester can turn into outright defiance, and defiance is something the family cannot afford. Rival families test them occasionally, sending low-level guys into Gambino-controlled clubs or skimming from joint ventures. Frank's response is measured. A quiet conversation with the right people, a subtle tightening of boundaries, a reminder that the Gambinos are neither inattentive nor in retreat. Violence is always the last option, but it remains an option everyone knows he'll use if necessary. At the same time, Frank is keeping an eye on shifts in the city's criminal landscape. The drug trade is booming, pulling in money faster than traditional rackets, but also bringing heavier law enforcement heat. Frank is cautious. He's seen too many men rise and fall on the back of fast, dirty money, and he advises a steady focus on established revenue streams. Some younger guys roll their eyes, but the older hands nod in agreement. Despite the tension, Frank never lets his public demeanor change. He's still in the bakeries, still at neighborhood events, still visible at weddings and funerals. That visibility reinforces an important truth. In a world where bosses and underbosses can seem distant, Frank is right there on the street, approachable and engaged, but privately, he's watching the weather. The law's patience is wearing thin, the boss's profile keeps climbing, and the quiet loyalty Frank has cultivated in so many corners may soon be tested. He doesn't know exactly what's coming, only that in this life, calm seas can turn rough in an instant, and when they do, the man at the wheel has to be ready to steer without flinching. By the spring of 1987, those rough currents Frank DeCicco has been anticipating begin to take shape. Rumors drift through the city, whispers of plots, talk of old grudges being settled, and suggestions that certain rival factions are looking to strike a blow at the heart of the Gambino family. The whispers are vague, but they carry an edge that makes even seasoned men pay closer attention to their surroundings. Frank notices the small signs first. A familiar car parked just a little too long near a meeting spot. Strangers loitering in places where outsiders don't usually wander. Conversations that cut off mid-sentence when a new face walks into the room. He doesn't jump to conclusions, but he files each observation away. In his world, a half-dozen small signs can add up to a warning loud enough to change a man's fate. As underboss, he's in a position that makes him both a shield for Gotti and a target in his own right. Many people still think that the boss is always the primary mark, but Frank knows from history that sometimes striking the second in command sends just as strong a message. He adjusts his routines, varies his routes, uses different cars, staggers his appearances at certain clubs. One afternoon, he's approached about attending a meeting in Brooklyn with members from another family to discuss a lingering territorial issue. It's not an unusual request. These sit-downs are part of the job, but something about the timing nags at him. He mentions it to Gotti, who waves it off, telling him to handle it the way he always does. Frank agrees, but the unease doesn't leave him. Still, business demands attention. The meeting is set for late April in a familiar part of Bensonhurst. Frank prepares as he always does, keeping his circle tight, ensuring the crew knows where he'll be, and planning his route with precision. On the morning of the meeting, he moves through his routine without hurry, masking the quiet tension in his gut. The streets are busy that day, with spring finally shaking the last chill out of the air. Kids are playing on sidewalks, storefront doors are propped open, and the hum of the neighborhood makes everything feel deceptively ordinary. Frank arrives at the location just as planned, stepping out of his car into the crisp sunlight. He doesn't know that somewhere nearby, men are waiting. Men who see him not as a respected underboss, but as the perfect opportunity to make their own statement. The morning of April 13th, 1987, starts out as ordinary as any other. Frank DeCicco has his coffee, scans the day's notes, and makes a few calls before heading toward Bensonhurst for a scheduled meeting. The air is brisk but clear, sunlight glinting off car roofs as he drives. Nothing in the rhythm of the day suggests that it will end differently from the countless others he's navigated. He pulls up near the Veterans and Friends Social Club, a familiar spot in the neighborhood, and parks his Buick. Around him, the street is alive in that casual Brooklyn way. People chatting on stoops, the distant thud of a basketball on asphalt, the smell of bread wafting from a nearby bakery. There's nothing outwardly threatening, nothing that would make an experienced man like Frank pause. Inside the club, a few early arrivals are already talking, cigarettes in hand, voices low. Frank exchanges greetings, steady and polite as always, before stepping back outside toward his car. He doesn't know that a vehicle parked nearby is wired with enough explosives to turn the street into chaos. The bomb is the work of rivals, men with old scores to settle, who see him as a strategic target that will rattle Gotti without triggering all-out war with the Gambinos full force. As Frank reaches for the door handle, the explosion erupts. The blast shatters windows up and down the block, sends shards of glass and metal into the air, and turns the quiet hum of the street into a roar of panic. People scatter, diving for cover. Smoke and dust billow into the spring sunlight, obscuring everything in a haze. Inside the club, chairs topple, and the men rush to the doorway, coughing through the dust. On the street, sirens begin to wail almost immediately, first distant, then swelling closer. Neighbors emerge from doorways, some shouting, some frozen in place, all staring toward the twisted wreckage of Frank's car. Frank is pulled from the scene by those who reach him first, but the injuries are catastrophic. The force of the blast has done its work, and it's clear even to the untrained eye that survival is impossible. The ambulance crew works quickly, but without hope. They know they are transporting a man already beyond saving. Many people still think that mob hits are carried out face to face as a matter of honor, but Frank's death is a reminder that in the shifting underworld of the late 80s, the rules are changing. Bombs are impersonal, indiscriminate, and impossible to argue with once they're triggered. By the time the news reaches John Gotti, the shock is immediate and visible. Frank wasn't just an underboss. He was Gotti's right hand, the man who kept the machine running smoothly. Losing him isn't just a personal blow. It's a threat to the stability of the entire organization. And as the smoke clears in Bensonhurst, everyone in the Gambino family knows the message has been sent. The shock of Frank DeCicco's death ripples through the Gambino family faster than any official word can travel. By nightfall on April 13th, 1987, every captain, soldier, and associate has heard the news, some from the street, others from the evening broadcasts replaying footage of twisted metal and scorched pavement in Bensonhurst. In a life where violence is an accepted hazard, there's still something jarring about the sudden loss of a man like Frank. John Gotti feels it most sharply. For all his public confidence, Gotti relied on Frank in ways few others fully understood. Frank wasn't just his underboss. He was the one who managed the balance between street crews and higher-level operations, the one who could diffuse a dispute without it reaching the boss's desk. Many people still think that an underboss is replaceable, that another man can simply step into the role and keep the gears turning. But Frank's relationships, built over decades, can't be replicated overnight. Within hours of the blast, law enforcement swarms the neighborhood. FBI agents and NYPD detectives cordon off the street, collecting fragments from the wreckage, photographing every angle. They know this wasn't a random act. Bombs don't just appear on a quiet Brooklyn block. To them, the question isn't whether this was a mob hit, but who ordered it and why. Inside the Gambino ranks, the speculation starts immediately. Some blame rival families. Most point to the Lucchese crew aligned with Victor Amuso and Anthony Casso. Others suggest internal betrayal, though fewer give voice to that theory publicly. Regardless of the source, the method is viewed as an escalation. Car bombs are rare in New York, seen as reckless because of the collateral damage risk. The fact that someone was willing to use one here is as much a statement as the killing itself. Gotti's response is measured, at least outwardly. There's no public vow of revenge, no immediate strike that would draw more heat from the FBI, who are already circling. Instead, the family closes ranks. Meetings are moved to more secure locations, and trusted men take over Frank's immediate responsibilities to prevent disruption in earnings. In the neighborhoods where Frank was a fixture, the morning is quieter, but no less real. Shopkeepers he once looked out for close early on the day of his wake. Old friends line the sidewalk outside the funeral home, speaking in low tones, recalling his steady demeanor, his quiet generosity. The turnout is significant, though not flashy, another calculated move to avoid unnecessary attention. For Gotti, the loss is both personal and strategic. He's lost the man who could temper his impulsive streak, the one who could turn big ideas into stable realities. Replacing that isn't just a matter of appointing a new underboss. It's about finding someone who can command respect across every layer of the family without igniting fresh rivalries. And in the unspoken language of the street, everyone understands the underlying truth. Frank DeCicco's death isn't the end of a story. It's the opening chapter of whatever comes next. And whatever comes will almost certainly be written in the same shadows where Frank once worked so quietly. In the days after Frank DeCicco's death, the Gambino family moves with a kind of disciplined urgency. Every captain, every trusted soldier understands that the vacuum left behind must be filled, at least functionally, before the family shows even a hint of instability. On the street, weakness invites trouble, and trouble is already circling. John Gotti convenes private meetings with his closest advisors. The conversations are quiet but intense, focused not only on replacing Frank's operational role, but on sending a clear message that the Gambinos remain united. There's no public mourning from the leadership, no speeches, no open displays of vulnerability. Many people still think that mob strength is shown in firepower, but here, it's shown in continuity. The money still moves, the meetings still happen, the phone calls still get returned. Behind the scenes, the investigation into the bombing heats up. FBI agents visit social clubs, lean on informants, and track movements in and out of neighborhoods known for hosting rival families. They ask questions everyone already knows the answers to, but no one gives them more than shrugs and vague statements. On paper, progress is slow. In reality, both law enforcement and the mob understand exactly who likely ordered the hit. They just have different methods for dealing with it. Inside the Gambino ranks, the shift is palpable. Frank's absence is felt in subtle ways. A meeting that runs longer because no one can steer it as efficiently. A dispute between captains that festers an extra day before being settled. The men who worked directly under him do their best to keep routines intact, but they know the glue that held so many moving parts together is gone. Gotti, ever the showman in public, grows more controlled in private. He speaks less in meetings, listens more, and chooses his words with the kind of precision Frank once counseled. It's as if he's carrying a piece of Frank's approach forward, even while stepping fully into the role of the family's undisputed decision-maker. On the street level, the reaction to Frank's loss is quieter, but no less telling. In Bensonhurst, older residents shake their heads when his name comes up, remembering him as the man who could get something fixed with a single phone call. Shopkeepers notice the absence of his regular check-ins, the ones where he'd ask about business in a tone that was both casual and deliberate. The funeral's final moments are marked by a stillness that feels heavier than silence. No grand gestures, no lingering speeches, just a steady procession of cars pulling away, each driver already thinking about the next move in a world that never pauses for long. In the hierarchy of the Gambino family, the underboss is the bridge between vision and execution. With Frank gone, Gotti now has to decide whether to appoint someone who will maintain that balance, or to keep the position in flux, while he tightens his own grip on every decision. Either choice will shape the family's direction for years to come, and for those watching from outside, the lesson is clear. The Gambinos have lost a steady hand, but they haven't lost their footing. Not yet. Frank DeCicco's story doesn't end in the wreckage on that Brooklyn street. It continues in the way he's remembered by those who knew him best. In the weeks after his death, conversations across the city return to the same themes: his steadiness, his loyalty, his ability to navigate between worlds without losing himself. For the Gambino family, he wasn't just an underboss. He was the man who kept the gears aligned when others wanted to push too fast or pull too hard. In the neighborhood, the memories are more personal. A shopkeeper recalls how Frank once made a problem disappear without asking for anything in return. A retired dock worker talks about the time Frank stepped in to settle a pay dispute that could have turned ugly. To them, he wasn't a headline or a cautionary tale. He was a man who could be counted on, even if everyone knew he operated in a world where trust was rare. Many people still think that men in his position are defined solely by violence, but Frank's influence came just as much from the conversations he kept short, the tempers he cooled, and the problems he solved before they became public. Inside the Gambino ranks, his absence reshapes the way business is done. Meetings that once ended in quiet agreements now drag into longer debates. Gotti, still the dominant figure, adjusts to life without the man who could translate his ambitions into workable plans without friction. Some captains step forward to fill parts of Frank's role, but no single man manages to replicate the balance he maintained. Time begins to do what it always does. It softens the edges of the story, blurring the details of how he lived and how he died. But among those who worked with him, the memory remains sharper. They remember the way he could walk into a room and make every man in it feel seen, without giving up a shred of authority. They remember that in a life where promises are often broken, his word was a rare thing that stayed good. Years later, younger men in the life will hear his name and know it stands for something solid. Not flash, not fear, but respect earned over decades. In a world built on shifting loyalties and sudden turns, that may be the rarest currency of all. And so, Frank DeCicco fades from the daily grind of headlines and police blotters into the quieter place where true legacies live, passed along in stories, in the way certain lessons are repeated, and in the unspoken standard he set for what it means to be steady in a life that almost never is. So now, as the last echoes of Frank DeCicco's story settle into memory, the pace softens. The sharp edges of the street fade, replaced by the slow rhythm of a Brooklyn evening, the kind where the air carries the scent of bread cooling in shop windows, and the glow of corner lamps pools softly on the sidewalk. You can almost hear the quiet conversations drifting from stoops, the low hum of a passing car, the shuffle of someone locking up for the night. It's in these calmer moments that the man behind the title comes into focus. Not just the underboss, not just the figure in the Gambino hierarchy, but the neighbor, the friend, the steady voice in a room full of raised ones. His way was never about noise. It was about presence, about knowing when to speak and when to let the silence do the work. Legacies in his world are fragile things. They can be rewritten by rivals, twisted by rumors, or buried under the weight of newer stories. But for those who knew him, Frank's legacy endures quietly, like the steady current beneath a still surface, and maybe that's the best way to remember him. Not in the flash of headlines or the sting of loss, but in the enduring calm he brought to a life that offered so little of it. So let the night stretch on. Let the noise of the city fade, and carry with you the thought that even in the most turbulent worlds, there are those rare souls who can stand in the middle of the storm and keep their footing. Sleep well with that thought, and may the quiet hold you steady until morning.